All right, welcome to another pop-up session of my YouTube live stream Weather and Climate Office Hours. This one again focused on the wildfire in Northern California, the Park Fire burning north of Chico, extending over a vast zone north and east of the foothills there. And then also I want to talk today a little bit about another fire, the Boreal Fire in the southern Sierra Nevada, I believe it's in Sequoia National Forest, that is also gaining a lot of ground. Haven't talked about that one as much. Today's session may be a little bit shorter. I just wanted to offer a bit of an update. But there is a lot going on, and the conditions have changed somewhat for the better, so that's the good news, at least in the short term. And at least for the Park Fire. But we're going to be this fire is going to be with us for weeks to come, and so I want to talk about what that looks like a little bit. Just a quick reminder that this channel is partially sponsored by Reask, a company that's rethinking Earth system risk. You can look for a link embedded in the video after I finish up. I'll add that after the fact. So I had a fairly late unanticipated live stream last night to talk about the rapid forward progression of the Park Fire toward Shingletown area, and the fire did end up indeed jumping Highway 36 in a number of locations. One person saying the sound is a little low. It looks okay on my end, so I'm going to proceed unless somebody else says the same. But the fire did end up jumping Highway 36 to the north and is now well established north of Highway 36, as had been the concern. But the good news is that northward run, although there was some structure loss in that area along the Highway 36 corridor where it jumped, it did get hung up a little bit on the topography, where there's a change in the slope aspect and in the vegetation context. But the main reason why it slowed down is the strong winds and atmospherically unstable conditions that the fire was sort of feeding off of itself in that area yesterday died down after midnight last night. And so the fire did not make it all the way toward Shingletown. It's still a good 5 or 6 miles away at least. Now, granted, this fire has easily run 50 miles in 2 days, so I'm not particularly reassured by a 5-mile gap in a direction that is consistent with what the prevailing wind may be for the foreseeable future. But at least relative to last night, the immediate risks to places like Shingletown, say today, I don't think the fire will reach Shingletown today. If it was going to imminently, it was going to do it last night, and it didn't do so. So today is looking a little better for now. Still, though, the area is now under a mandatory evacuation order, and that will likely remain because it is quite possible, if not likely, that the fire will eventually make it up to that area. It just probably won't happen on short notice today because the weather conditions are now more favorable. It is cooler, significantly cooler in the fire zone right now. In fact, it's the coolest it's been in this area for weeks in most places. And as a result, the humidity also came up somewhat. So certainly nothing like rain, so no precipitation, nothing that's going to extinguish anything, but certainly conditions that hamper the extreme, the continuously extreme types of fire behavior that we have been seeing on this fire since its ignition. Hard to believe, still less than 3 full days ago. I believe it'll be 3 full days in about an hour from now or so. So this change in the weather is fortuitous for now. I'm not sure that it really changes the long-term, pretty grim outlook for this fire, frankly, but it does offer some good news right now, certainly today and maybe for the next few days in relative terms. This fire is burning in such decadent vegetation settings, places where there's been no fires for decades. So there's very little recent fire history. There's very dense vegetation, and it's quite remote and rural in many places. There's some state highways, but these are mostly windy 2-lane roads through very dense forest or brushy regimes. So there aren't a huge number of opportunities for fire breaks in that sense given the conditions. There are some fire footprints. The big one to the east eventually is the Dixie footprint, but it's still a ways away from getting there. Closer to where the fire is actively burning is the Ponderosa burn footprint, but that's over 10 years old now, and there's been a lot of regrowth within it, including some forestry plantations with a bunch of head height tree saplings evenly spaced. So in the past, we've seen that be quite flammable, so I'm not totally convinced that burn footprint is going to provide as much of a barrier to further spread versus the Dixie footprint, which very likely will, at least in areas very close to the populated areas near Chester, where there's been a lot of post-fire mitigation work, maybe less so in the less severely burned areas where there's been a fair bit of regrowth of grass and brush, and where many of the trees were not killed by the fire originally. Anyway, this fire has got a lot of room to grow still, to the east, but especially to the north. And to the north, there really isn't much to stop it. The only thing that's working in our favor today is that winds are weak and temperatures are cooler. The vegetation, though, is still super, super dry, kiln dried by a month of record-breaking heat and evaporative demand leading up to this point. So that's still there, even though the temperatures right now are cooler and the relative humidity is up a little bit. Every little bit helps, but it's not like we're seeing a nice rainstorm or something. This is not going to fundamentally alter the course. But what it might help with is get some fire line in on the northern flank and protect some of the structures up there while this fire isn't super active. It's also helping potentially along the eastern flank, that all-important eastern flank along Highway 32, which is what separates the fire from places like Paradise and Magalia. And last night, all of Paradise was placed under an evacuation warning. Warning, not an order, a warning being the lesser of the two designations. Understandably, I'm assuming that almost everybody there is quite nervous, given the history of Paradise and fire in the last decade. Right now, Paradise is not immediately at risk. There isn't an extreme wind event that's going to push this fire into Paradise. On the other hand, between Paradise and where the fire currently is a large area of unburned, dense fuels that didn't really burn in the campfire, and so Paradise is hypothetically at risk from this fire, significant risk, and there's been regrowth within the even within the campfire burn zone as well. But right now, the good news there, at least, no strong wind event. It would have to go upslope, so uphill, the opposite direction from the campfire to reach Paradise, and there's no strong west or southwest wind event in the offing right now. Could be some afternoon breezes like that, and I think that's probably why the evacuation warning was issued, because there is at least a slight chance that afternoon breezes could blow up the fire and some really heavy fuels that are there and spot it over the ridgeline. I don't think it's super likely under the current weather conditions, but there is a reason why that evacuation warning was issued. There's been a pretty aggressive firefight, it sounds like, this morning along that Highway 32 corridor. With a number of slopovers, meaning that the fire has jumped the highway to the eastern side, although they've been catching them so far, with really aggressive ground campaign and airdrops. That might become a little bit trickier later today. That's the flank on which the fire is waking up right now, so despite the cooler temperatures, the eastern flank of the fire is starting to light up again on infrared satellite imagery. It does look quite toasty again, although again not as dramatic, nearly as dramatic as it was the first 2 days it was burning. The infrared signature, and I'll show you this in a minute on the screen, is not nearly as hot on the northern flank as it was yesterday or last night, but it is still burning. It's not like the fire extinguished, it's just burning at a lower intensity. One challenge today is that there is a little bit of a localized inversion. There's some smoke trapped in the valleys, there's some smoke lingering over the fire. That may be interfering with some air operations in some places because of lack of visibility. There is good visibility on the southeastern flank right now. That may change later today as the smoke blows in, so the one downside to lighter winds is that the smoke is lingering locally rather than immediately being vented into the atmosphere and blown away by stronger winds. So that means that the fire won't spread as quickly, but it also means that air operations might become limited. They're still doing it where they can, but there might be portions of the fire that are essentially inaccessible because it's too dangerous to fly aircraft at very low elevations to do bucket drops and helicopters, or in particular retardant drops from air tankers, because those planes, those firefighting aviators will fly those slurry bombers at very low elevations compared below the height of mountain peaks within canyons. So it's a dangerous job, and it is objectively dangerous. In fact, just yesterday there was confirmation that an air tanker in Oregon did crash and kill the pilot on one of these kinds of runs. So it's a good reason why, if visibility is bad, that does usually nix those kind of air operations, because you can't necessarily see the ridgeline in front of you, and sometimes you're only flying a couple 100 feet or so above the treetops with a huge aircraft containing a lot of very heavy, mainly water-based substance that can slosh around a lot. So it's it is fascinating to see the modern firefighting apparatus that we have come into full swing. I think what we're realizing is that even with probably the most well-resourced wildland firefighting agency in the world in California, CAL FIRE, a fire of this scope, while we're in better shape than we would be had we not made those investments in wildland firefighting, it's still beyond technology to address a fire at that scope. So, I've done a ton of news media interviews in the last 48 hours on this, and one of the questions that often comes up, especially from media outlets that are international or not familiar with Western wildfires, why don't they just put out the fire? Why don't you just spray water on it? And I think it's difficult for some folks to conceive of a fire that moves 50 miles in 2 days, burning at a forward speed of somewhere between 1 and 4 miles per hour. So depending on how good of a runner you are, I mean, that's either a brisk walk or a slow jogging pace continuously, irrespective of the terrain as the crow flies. That's just, you just can't get ahead of it when the vegetation is this dense and this record dry following this record heat. And it certainly doesn't help, of course, that there's essentially no recent fire history in this entire region. So that's the challenge. It's a grand challenge. There will be successes. I'm guessing that the western flank of the fire and the southern flank of the fire will probably, this is the weather pattern that will help a lot with control. So Chico probably not at much risk at this point. The western flank further north has been active as recently as last night, but this might be a good day to get a better handle on that. I suspect that they will take advantage of that once the smoke clears out with some southwest winds. They'll probably aggressively line that westward flank to prevent its further progression toward the Sacramento Valley, and there's a good chance they'll be successful because that's mainly burning in grass, and if you can paint a long retardant line there, usually you can stop a grass fire with a heavy retardant line, especially if you don't have winds aggressively trying to push it across. So that's my guess. A lot of the progress is going to be on the western and the southern flanks. Maybe some progress too on the southeastern flank along Highway 32, so that would be good news for Paradise, but Paradise not completely out of the woods still at this point. North of the fire, though, could be some limited progress on the ground today. It'd be harder for air resources to get in there. Northeastern flank of the fire, though, this thing is just continuing to blow out, so it's just continuing its north and northeastward march. Evacuation advisory is as far north now as Lassen Park, Volcanic Park, and they could extend even farther north than that. Again, this is a fire that started in Bidwell Park, just east of Chico, and could well make it to Lassen. Single fire. This is not a complex fire. Sometimes we get the largest fire, quote unquote, in state history is the August Complex Fire, which because you might get from the name, it's a complex of fires. The August Complex was a cluster of about 12 to 15 individual ignitions, individual fires that burned so aggressively they all merged together and became one large contiguous million-plus acre blob. But they were not from a single ignition point. So was it one large million-acre burned area? Yes. But was it actually one fire originally? No. That's what makes this event, which is now confirmed to have burned at this point 350,000 acres at last check. I did a double take with that. Probably more than that now because it just continues to burn at a reduced but still significant rate to the north and east. 350,000 acres would have been the largest fire in modern California history, I believe, as recently as a decade ago. It's been blown out of the water since then. But this is a fire that's very likely, I mean, it's almost not a very bold prediction to say that the final acreage will exceed 500,000 acres. We're already above 350,000, and there's an enormous amount of unburned land with no obvious barriers to stop it between where the fire currently is and there. Could it become a 1,000,000-acre fire? It's possible. I mean, that's informed speculation. That is going to depend on the weather conditions. That's going to depend on luck and the level of resources that are available for firefighting, which may become a problem because there are now other large fires in California and certainly throughout the West that will increasingly compete for resources in the coming days. So it's hard to say. Can we rule out a 1,000,000-acre fire? No. There is a plausible footprint that could encompass 1,000,000 acres with this single ignition point. So we will just have to see. But the good news today, it is cooler, the humidity's higher, the winds are lighter, some hampered ability for air operations, but that does improve ability of ground operations to make progress, and it does mean that I don't think the Highway 44 Shingletown corridor is necessarily at risk today, although it still well may be in the days to come. So the weather outlook, today is cooler, and today and Sunday may be the coolest days. There may be some breezes, so it's light winds now. There may be diurnal winds, and that there will probably be a pulse and fire activity later this afternoon on most of California's fires. There is a red flag warning actually still in effect for the Boreal fire in the Southern Sierra. So the burning conditions there are more active and adverse today than they are in Northern California. So a bit of a different story there, and that one is also threatening structures down by Bodfish. So that's another emerging story. That fire is now, I believe, well above 10,000 acres now. So another significant fire, although, it's missing a 0 relative to the Park fire, and then some. This week, relatively cool conditions will continue, perhaps through Tuesday. So not dramatically cold, but much cooler than it has been through about Tuesday. Could be some breezes at times, and then things are going to heat up again rapidly starting around Wednesday. So unfortunately, it's a strong signal for a major, persistent heat wave once again across the entire American and Canadian West. That is really going to exacerbate the wildfire situation once again and is going to make fires like the Park fire behave more extremely once again. So we have a few days here where the weather is more favorable for some partial marginal control on certain portions of the fire line here. Probably not on the northern and eastern flanks so much, but definitely on the western and southern flanks. And it's then it's going to get worse again. It's going to get hotter. There's no rain in sight. There could be windier, hotter, and drier conditions to come starting in 5 to 7 days. So this is the best weather we're going to get for the foreseeable future. The fire is not going to be extinguished in the next 5 to 7 days nor contained, so this fire will still be burning across a fairly broad, uncontained flank when the next major heat wave arrives. That is one reason why I'm fairly pessimistic, in the sense that this fire is going to get a lot larger before conditions change. So that's, I want to show some imagery now. I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me, you'll see the infinite window once again briefly before I switch things over. Okay, so this is again the Watch Duty app. This is the Park fire, officially 348,000 acres at last check, but almost certainly at this point above 350 in reality. These orange splotches are indications of where the most recent satellite overpass saw heat signatures. So you can see that the southern and southwestern flanks are pretty cold and maybe even extinguished at this point for the most part. The eastern flank is still very active. The northern flank and the northwestern flank very active. The red zones, places where there's mandatory evacuations, which again now extend from near Chico to near Lassen Peak, an extraordinarily vast swath of portions of 4 counties. and then an even wider area of evacuation warnings extending all the way to the shore of Lake Almanor to the east, and the Highway 99 corridor in some spots to the west. That is essentially to the Sacramento River in some spots. This is just a vast, vast region. Doesn't mean that all places are equally at risk. Again, the most danger of aggressive spread is anywhere from directly to the north and to the northeast. So this area is spreading sort of like this, parallel to Highway 32, and then this is sort of spreading radially from a northwest to northeastward swath. So everything up here, Shingletown, Manton, definitely still at risk. And then I want to zoom out and show you the other major fire. There are several other fires, but right now the other one of real note is the Boreal fire. The Trout fire remains active too, but that's been a lightning fire that's been skunking around for a while. It's a cool 22,000 acres. But the Boreal fire is newer and it's larger. It's 32,000 acres. It did cause structure loss last night when it burned through the historic town of Havilah. I believe that's the name of the town. You can see it here along Caliente Budfish Road. This fire blew through there yesterday and could conceivably, depending on how things go, threaten region around Lake Isabella. There's a pretty broad mandatory evacuation zone you can see in Kern County, mainly all these red areas. So again, a lot of room to burn. This is also in between recent burn areas. So now we have two major fires filling in the gaps, one in the southern Sierra and one in the northern Sierra foothills, transitioning into the mountains themselves. So this is a significant and potentially dangerous fire in its own right. It's also going to compete for resources with the Park Fire, even though it's only a tenth of the size. These are the two major fires right now. There have been some fires in the Bay Area. Yesterday there was the Creek Fire, which burned, it looks about 600 acres. But although containment is relatively low, it doesn't look like it has a lot of potential to expand further. So there could be other fires that pop up. The Hill Fire is, of course, still active. That's been burning for a long time. It's in a remote area, not as much of a concern. There is also in northern Nevada, there's a 10,000 acre, the Stockade Canyon Fire. You can see this occasionally on the infrared satellite view of the Park Fire. It's pretty big, obviously, although it's in a very remote area and not a lot of people live there, so I don't think there's a tremendous amount of resources devoted to it right now. But again, it is at a certain point a zero-sum game. There are only so many resources available per region. As you can see, these red areas are red flag warnings. There's a localized one, including the Trout and Boreal fires today. So those could be very active. And then elsewhere in the west, there's some red flag warnings. Utah, western Colorado, Idaho. This is for gusty winds and dry lightning. And you can see the sea of wildfire activity up in the interior of the Pacific Northwest, particularly in Oregon, Idaho, and eastern Washington. You can't see the fire numbers up in BC, but you can see the satellite detections, and you can see that there are still a number of hotspots, even though they just got some rain. So fire activity likely to ramp up again in Western Canada once again as the heat returns. Won't spend too much time, on that one. Okay, so I want to show some satellite imagery. This is the live, just checking to make sure everything is as it should be. Visible satellite view. I'm going to bring up my drawing tool for a moment here. So you can see this sort of axis of smoke. There's a little bit of elevated convective activity, even some dry thunderstorms up here. And you can see some sort of elevated cumulus clouds sort of trying to form in the smoke plume. The other thing you can kind of see is, if you notice that there's a center of circulation, kind of like this, there's an upper level low. This is partly what allowed for the instability for all of those pyroconvective clouds to develop over the fire yesterday with extreme fire behavior. There's a bit of an unstable atmosphere. There's also been a wind shift. You can see that the air was kind of stagnant, but now on the backside of this low, there's sort of wind that's at upper levels that's going to start to do this. This might start to clear out the smoke, heat up the surface, and start to push the fire, which is in this area. You can't see it because it's all under the smoke, back up slope later today. And And you can see that there's some drift smoke at higher altitudes making it south toward the Bay Area, but this isn't going to reach the surface, so it really shouldn't affect air quality too much. In that region, a little bit of smoke moving through northern Lake Tahoe region. But the main thing I wanted to show you is that this smoke plume is just sort of stagnant right now. This is one reason why air operations might be limited in some spots due to visibility. But if I look at the infrared view, we get a bit of a different picture. I'm going to bring out my drawing tool once again, and this is an outline of the current fire footprint. You can see it because it's altered the landscape so much. It's showing up on infrared satellite. That is an enormous fire. Compare it again to Lake Tahoe down here. It's multiple times the size of Lake Tahoe. The other piece I wanted to illustrate is that there is a little bit of heat on the western flank here. But this part of the fire, which was very active last night, is colder right now, so that means that there's lower intensity fire activity. There's some opportunity for ground crews to make more safe progress up in here. That's good news. But the fire is already really active again today on the eastern flank. That's where the heat is showing up. That's along Highway 32, and then on the northeastern flank here as well. These signatures have been steadily increasing throughout the day. And this flank of the fire is probably where the greatest activity is going to be today amid more favorable weather conditions. Okay, and to show you that, this is what the fire looks like, that side of the fire right now. I'll do a 1 hour loop, and you'll see this is how the fire has, the eastern flank of the park fire. So this is what I mean by less active. That is still a very active wildfire. This is not a fire that's lying down. It's still producing smoke plumes a few thousand feet tall, but that's different from producing smoke plumes 25,000 feet tall as they were yesterday. So this is what we mean by reduced activity. It's still burning, it's still moving forward and chewing through forest, but at a lesser pace. I still think there's going to be a burst where we may see some increased activity on this camera later today once again. Moving south to the Boreal fire, I'll show you a loop from a distance here. Again, the last hour, you can see this is a very active fire putting up a big pyrocumulus plume. So again, this fire is more active in the southern Sierra. And if I go back on this one, you'll see that there are a number of different views. That one looks a little bit ugly. You can kind of see this fire coming in. Trying to get a closer view, perhaps, of... I think the Breckenridge can. I don't know where that one is. Here we are. So the fire is getting close to the Breckenridge cams. You can see that there's some beetle-killed pines. This is an area that hasn't burned, so this is going to be another very active firefight today. And there's one other thing I wanted to show. I know some folks are not a fan of Twitter, but this is the only place this video is available, so I'm going to show it here. This was shared by Michael Steinberg. This was taken by fire crews on the ground. This is the best evidence I've seen so far of an actual tornado strength fire vortex. Pay attention in particular to the first 5 seconds of this footage. This is the one from a couple days ago on the park fire, by the way, and then they decide to get the heck out of Dodge. I'll show it again from the beginning. Again, it's just the first 5 seconds, but you can see this swirling cloud. That appears to have a rotational velocity consistent with a weak tornado. So this would be the feature that everybody was seeing and talking about on radar. It looks like this was probably a tornado strength fire vortex, as had been assumed. So I don't know if we'll ever get formal corroboration. It's never really clear exactly whose job it is to do that. The Weather Service has done it in a few exceptional cases, but our CAL FIRE has participated. Frankly, I'm just not sure that there's much appetite for an investigation, so this might be the closest we get. I think this is probably it. I think it happened. So anyway, I thought folks would find that interesting. Last thing I wanted to show graphically is what's coming next weather-wise. So this is the current the 5-day average temperature map ending on Wednesday this week. Woohoo! It's slightly cooler than average in the Bay Area and along the coast, with near average conditions in the fire zone. That's a good thing. That will help to a modest extent. Note though that if we're, again, and I'm going to show where the fire is, we're talking about up here, it's not like it's much cooler than average. It's right around the long-term average. We just have been so record hot recently that this cool down is going to feel cooler than it really is in comparative terms. So along the immediate coast, it might actually be a bit cooler than average. But then watch what happens as we go through the week. So this is 5 days average ending Wednesday afternoon, ending Thursday afternoon. Friday afternoon, we're already back to above average temperatures in the fire zone. And by next weekend, we're back to well above average temperatures, potentially a major heat wave across essentially the entire western U.S. Again, this is the fire zone in the northern Sierra, and this is the fire zone in the southern Sierra, both looking like 6 to 9 degrees Celsius, so well above 10 to 15 degrees above average Fahrenheit. That's a major heat wave for early August. Will it be as extreme as the one in July? Probably not, but right now that doesn't even matter because we're dealing with the vegetation dryness legacy of that event, and so a severe heat wave, even if it's not as record-breaking or prolonged or intense, is still going to cause significant problems. And the other thing is that this lingers out through 360 hours with no signs of slowing down. That's 2+ weeks in the future. So once it gets hot again in about 5 to 7 days, it's probably not going to cool off again in these fire zones indefinitely. All signs point to a much hotter than average, maybe even a record warm August across much of the West. And this extends up into British Columbia and across all of the active fire zones I was just pointing out earlier. So this is a concerning outlook, especially given that there will be, at times, breezy conditions with occasional dry thunderstorm events scattered throughout the region. Don't see any right now in the near term for California, but east of California and north of California, this is going to be a real concern. If we look at the dynamics, the upper ridge type, get on a different map here. What we see is not necessarily, so this is now, we don't have any ridging over California, but it rapidly reemerges by later in the week. Not necessarily, this is not normalized. I meant to normalize this. My apologies. 5-day. Oh, interesting. Am I in the wrong model here? Well, anyway, the normalized anomaly, this is sort of what will look like by early August. Again, that's a pretty major heat signal for California and the broader West, with the big major Four Corners Ridge being much stronger than usual on its southwestern flank. So that's California to a T. If you're wondering if it was going to rain in the fire zone, the answer is nope. No indication of rain. Could be some southern Sierra isolated thunderstorms, but again, this is accumulated over the next 15 or 16 days. This is actually even less precipitation than you'd usually get during the monsoon season in southeastern California, and there's no indication anything is going to make it up to the fire zone up here. You can pretty much discount the lowest contour level. That's essentially, for all intents and purposes, 0. And the other thing to note, too, over this period is not only is it going to be hot, but it is going to be dry across much of the West. Pacific Northwest, British Columbia, the Southwest, all of these areas receiving less precipitation than usual during this period. So hot and dry, wildfire situation will respond accordingly. So you're going to see me come back on screen momentarily. All right, I'm going to go through and take a look at the questions. Folks are reporting that it's kind of foggy and drizzly in the Bay Area today. This is partly just because we don't have that really strong ridge suppressing the marine layer right now. Plus, there was that cutoff low pressure system, which is actually enhancing the onshore flow into the Bay Area through the Carquinez Strait into the Delta. So it's not that uncommon this time of year when that happens to get a marine layer surge. And if you have a particularly robust marine layer, you can get some drizzle from that low cloud layer, that stratus deck, which is apparently what's happened. Nice if you can experience it. That's not going to affect the fire zone, though, of course. That's much higher elevation and much farther inland. A question from Ryan: do you think that recent large fires in Northern California have created localized climate changes that have contributed to the park's fires' behavior? That's an interesting question because we know at this point that climate change is making the severity and the extent of wildfires in California and the western US and globally outside of the tropical savanna belt worse. So, more intense because of hotter temperatures, drier vegetation at peak dryness, and more atmospheric demand for moisture. All of that tends to dry out the vegetation and result in more intense and faster moving, and in many cases larger fires. But that's at global scale. Obviously if it gets warmer, that's something that's changing at global scale. So this is an interesting question about how the recent large fires, I think in this context, maybe like the Dixie Fire, which burned almost 1,000,000 acres, about 30 to 50 miles east of the current park fire zone. That's a very large fire, and it has transformationally altered a large portion of the landscape. And it will remain that way for decades, if not longer. They may be permanent in some cases. The answer is that it does modify the local environment. It certainly modifies the local environment during winter when we have storms. It changes the albedo. So now instead of dark coniferous tree canopies, we have exposed soil initially, or dirt and grass. That alters the hydrologic characteristics, so the runoff characteristics of the watersheds certainly, and the snow accumulation characteristics. In the summer, it probably does increase surface temperature because the dark canopies of trees tend to absorb solar radiation. If you get rid of a lot of those tree canopies, as that fire did, it may be even hotter there than it once was. So it is possible that the recent fires, by a couple of degrees, maybe have further amplified the local heating within some of these recent high-intensity fire footprints beyond what global warming would have done on its own. So there's a bit of a self-reinforcing feedback. What's interesting is that in the park fire zone, though, there has not been any history of large recent fires, and so I think that's less likely to be the case there, although it might then end up being important if this fire does eventually burn into, say, the Dixie Fire footprint, which it well may. That's a good question. I think it's probably not a huge factor right now. It could be a small factor later, depending on where this fire goes. But there's also the indirect effects in terms of the hydrologic implications. What is runoff going to look like the next time there's a really big sequence of atmospheric rivers up in these watersheds? A lot of the watersheds burned in the Dixie, that was 1,000,000 acres. If this fire becomes a 500,000 to 1,000,000 acre fire, as it appears likely to end up somewhere in that range, that could be up to 2,000,000 acres cumulatively burned within a 3-year period, potentially at a fairly high intensity in some cases. That's a good portion of the watershed, and could have significant implications for downstream flood risk. So that actually might have larger implications, not during fire season, but during the not fire season in winter. Interesting question. I'm not a huge expert specifically in that, but often when we do these kinds of studies, that tends to be the kind of effect that we see. All right, let's see. There's a question about the fires in Oregon and the Cascades. There are many of them, and in the last couple days they've been a little calmer than they were the previous days prior. That may continue for a few more days, but as I mentioned, all of Oregon and Washington is going to get very hot again in about 5 to 7 days, and I would expect a lot of those fires to become very active and potentially more dangerous again during that period. So I'm not as familiar with the specifics. At a certain point, you gotta specialize a little bit regionally, but I would expect to see a continued partial lull, although there's still active fires, the next few days before they really pick up again in intensity later this week. That would be my estimate. There's a question about the differences in the satellite heat detections from the different sensor platforms available, MODIS, VERS, and GOES. The important thing to understand is that all of them are behind the curve. You're always looking at the past. You're never looking at... so you can get live satellite images of the photographs that I've been showing you, the actual visible images that look exactly what you'd look like if you could use a telescope from the International Space Station looking down in real time. You can get that with just a couple of minutes latency. But the thermal detections don't happen continuously, and often what you're getting is data that's as much as 6 to 12 hours old. GOES can be more real time, so that is probably the best option for real time, but even then there's often still latency, and it can't always see through clouds, so you never know. Clouds, of course, including dense smoke plumes, so you can't always be sure that you're seeing everything you're seeing. There's false positives and false negatives. False positives can occur when GOES detects a fire over a much broader region than is actually burning because it's detecting the hot smoke plume. So it's detecting the plume itself as the fire. These are called hot pixels, and it's not actually an indicator of where the fire is, it's an indicator of where the smoke plume is. So that's an example of a false positive fire detection via these platforms, but a false negative might be if the fire is so intense and so extreme that it's generating a pyrocumulonimbus cloud. The satellite can't see through that cloud, and so it's not going to detect any fire, even if there's a very extreme fire on the ground. So useful tools, they have different latencies, different strengths and weaknesses, but just keep in mind that you can't rely on it always to be perfectly available in real time. There's often as much multi-hour latency and lots of false positives and false negatives. Still, it's sometimes the best tool we have. There's a question about why clear cutting does not help with fire suppression. So commercial logging, preferentially, as you might expect, commercial logging is an effort to take the most valuable mature trees, meaning usually the tallest and widest diameter trunks, out of a given setting. Those are precisely the parts of a forest ecosystem that are the most fire resilient. You can often have large mature trees, even in a fairly intense fire, that will not burn. Partly because they're thick-skinned, if you will, because of the bark and the trunk itself, but also because large mature trees often will have fewer branches low down on the trunk, so less ladder fuel. And so a fire, even if it's got 5 or 10 foot flame lengths, might just scorch the bottom of the trunk and knock it up into the branches. Whereas smaller trees, younger trees, say saplings that are anywhere from a couple of feet tall, maybe 10 or 20 feet tall, they often have branches all the way down to the ground, forming ladder fuels, meaning that those are the trees that tend to burn most completely in a fire. So if in a commercial logging setting or a clear cut, you've removed all the mature big trees that are fire resilient and left behind most of the trees that are the most flammable, these younger trees with more ladder fuels that are shorter. And in addition, depending on which company and what their policies are, sometimes there's lots of what's called slash. So these machines that do the logging, they'll cut off all the branches, all the pine needles, all the leaves of whatever kind of tree you're logging will fall on the ground. Sometimes it can be quite deep. Sometimes it can be feet deep. So depending on the level of management, you may have removed all of the fire resilient trees, left all of the younger, more flammable ones that form their own ladder fuels, and then also left a couple of foot deep layer of tree branches and pine needles and leaves on the forest floor. Some clear cuts are a little more responsible than that, but in many cases that's what the landscape looks like. And you can imagine that's just an unbelievable recipe for intense fire, because you have this literal kindling, large diameter kindling in some cases on the forest floor, enough non-mature flammable trees to carry a flame and give it some pretty tall flame lengths. And so those can be quite flammable. We often see that the tree plantations, both after they've been clear cut and before, can be quite flammable too. Even a mature stand of plantation trees can be quite flammable because it's often a monoculture. It's usually just one species of trees. They're planted at pretty close spacing for commercial profitability reasons, and they're also of uniform age. So they're all at approximately the same height. In a mature forest, you'll have trees of all different ages and heights. Some of them might provide ladder fuels, but some of them will be mature and won't burn in a fire. But in a plantation forest, sometimes you'll have all trees that are plus minus 20 years old, and they all have ladder fuels, and the whole thing will just go up all at once because they're closely spaced and of uniform height and age. So plantation forests can actually be much more flammable than natural forests. Clear cuts, so logging, commercial logging, can be result in increased flammability of the landscape relative to not. There are other forms of land management and even some forms of logging that can be less destructive. I'm not an ecologist. There's quite vehement disagreements exactly the cost and benefits of different types of forest treatments and logging in different settings. So I'm not going to get into the details except to say that the kinds of clear cuts that you often see do not decrease fire risk. In fact, more often than not, they increase fire risk, especially because they aren't followed up after the fact, after the clear cut, with any sort of fire smart management plan. Or prescribed burning could be part of that too, potentially, but we don't usually see that because, again, these are commercially managed forests for profit rather than for ecosystem health. And the kind of forest treatments that you would do if you're trying to improve the health of the ecosystem and reduce fire risk are in many cases the opposite of what you do if you're trying to maximize profitability of a forestry operation or a plantation or a clear cut. That's the challenge, is that those two goals are often in direct opposition to one another. And there are ways to mitigate that conflict, but I think at a certain point they are sort of antithetical to one another at a fairly fundamental level. So again, I'm not an ecologist, talk to the ecologist about that one, but that's sort of why these clear cuts are not going to provide a barrier to fire spread in this context or generally in other contexts. And as Mary points out, you can see these clear cuts, if it looks like a checkerboard grid pattern, if you go on Google Earth or Google Maps and look at the fire region, that's what that is. These clear cuts are often in a checkerboard pattern, and the checkerboard, the sort of white or brown in color, is usually where the clear cuts have been. That was a question about climate change and windy summers in California. Honestly, we don't know. It's fascinatingly, we don't have a good theory or understanding exactly how winds at regional scale might change in a warming climate. I know that sounds kind of wild, but we don't. And so it has been pretty windy the last few years. It's not clear that that's part of something that's going to continue, though, because of a warming climate. But we also can't rule it out because we don't really understand these processes very well. So stay tuned. As a comment that a large burn area could affect the wind at ground level, at the fire level, it could. You can sometimes see increased surface winds in places where you've removed a lot of vegetation, although there can be some counter effects because you've removed some of the surface roughness and the turbulence at the surface, and so sometimes you get better vertical mixing of winds from aloft down to the surface under different patterns. So yes, there definitely can be that kind of effect, but your mileage may vary depending on the exact context. Daphne mentions that there's more footage of some fire or tornado activity. We'll see if that's actually the full-fledged fire tornado. There's footage of some pretty impressive fire whirls that aren't really tornadic-like, that are a little more common on fires of this size. But I'll check that out, see if there's some additional information. All right, so I think I'm going to wrap this one up pretty soon, but just wanted to say thanks again for joining. I'll continue to have these at TBD times. Probably won't have one tomorrow or later today because hopefully the relatively quieter weather will result in fewer things for me to update people rapidly on, but it is very helpful if you subscribe. Thanks to those who have in recent weeks. You'll be notified when I have these live streams. Sometimes I schedule them out longer in advance than others. You can also help support the channel via the link I posted at the beginning of the comments section. And also sharing these sessions on different channels. Twitter and X have become, right now it's better than it was yesterday, but there have been periods where fire and weather related hashtags have been completely saturated with NSFW related spam making them unusable. And so I'm on a bunch of different platforms now. Of course, I'm here on YouTube, but you can also find me on Twitter and X. I'm still there as always, but also now extending to Blue Sky, to Threads, to Mastodon, and then if you're interested in my weather and cloud photographs only, you can also follow me on Instagram. But I don't do any science or late breaking information there. With that, I think I'll wrap up. Probably talk with everybody a little bit later this week again, so probably won't be a long gap. See you then.